Hi everyone. Firstly, welcome and thank you all for the interest in the cognitive debate. I'm Yunus from CogIST, and I will briefly introduce the event and CogIST. CogIST is an independent community based in Istanbul, Turkey, and our members are mostly undergraduate students or grad students studying some subfields or some subfield of cognitive science. And our main aim is to provide a platform where fellow cognitive scientists exchange their ideas and collaborate with each other. And our second aim is to make cognitive science more accessible to the public audience. And we do a lot of things for these, and if you are curious about them, you can visit our website or follow our social media accounts. Cognitive Debate is such an event that we organize annually. Last time we talked about embodied cognition and meta theory of cognitive science, and today's subject is ecological psychology, its past, its current status, and more importantly, its future. And thank you all the discussants and the moderator Andrew Wilson for they accepted our invitation. And I think that's all. Andrew, you can take the lead and introduce yourself and the other discussants. Thank you again.
Brilliant, thank you. So hello and welcome to everybody. My name is Andrew Wilson. I'm a reader in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds in the UK. And I'm an ecological psychologist and have been for a depressingly long period of time now. So I studied at Indiana University with Jeff Bingham and studied coordinated rhythmic movement. And my primary interests are around skilled movement, skill acquisition. I'm also very interested in affordance perception and trying to understand information in a little bit more detail. And so, yeah, so thank you for everyone's interest. Thank you for the invite for putting this together. I'll be moderating the discussion over the course of the next little while. I've invited three members of the ecological community to come and chat to us and tell us a little bit about their research, talk to us a little bit about how they became an ecological psychologist, what their particular field of research is, and what that research program looks like when you're doing things ecologically. We'll talk a little bit about what it is about the ecological approach that these researchers find useful, and what keeps them in the field. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future and some things that we hope to see as the ecological approach develops. So for a long time now, the ecological approach has been busy establishing itself and as a presence in cognitive science. And I think it's fair to say that that's been very successful. We're a very well-established part of the community now. And of course, that's primarily focused around issues of perception and action, skilled movement, things like that. But the field is now starting to expand now that we've got that nice sort of base and we've sort of established ourselves that we have something to contribute, that we have something to say. We're now starting to engage with some of the bigger, broader questions that are going on in cognitive science, and the speakers, I hope, represent that quite nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a few questions as we go through, just to structure things, and then I'll invite the speakers to come through and give us a little chat. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get each of them to talk a little bit about their personal journey, about how they came to ecological psychology, how they sort of found it, how they discovered it, and where it's taken them to the present day. So what we'll do, and I'll bring them in one at a time and get them to talk a little bit. So we'll introduce them. So we'll talk to Robyn Wilford first. So Robyn's a PhD student at the University of Toronto in Canada, and her research aims to integrate insights from dynamical systems theory, ecological psychology, and cognitive neuroscience to investigate brain behavior relationships at the individual level of analysis. And in particular, her research, she's using fMRI to study the dynamics of event perception and memory. So if you are familiar at all with the ecological approach, there's a few things in there that are not normally associated with this. So that'll be good. So Robyn, if you just want to come in and chat to us for a little bit, tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. So yeah, as Andrew's introduction kind of pointed to, I'm I don't know, a little bit of a black sheep in both ecological psychology and cognitive neuroscience because of my interest in both. And this all came about during my undergraduate at Western University in Canada. I got my degree in developmental cognitive neuroscience, so my coursework was very much like within the cogneuro tradition. But while I was there, I met some philosophers at the Robyn Institute of Philosophy, including Vicente, Ed Baggs, Michael Anderson, and I joined their interdisciplinary lab where I did some research, both like conceptual and theoretical, and a little bit of like empirical and analytical work. And what truly, some of the stuff at the beginning I was a little unsure of with ecological psychology, but what truly sold me was when we as a group read Gibson's 1979 book, An Ecological Approach to Perception. And it kind of shifted my perspective on how to think about psychology, kind of reframing my focus and my reading of the material I was learning in my courses, trying to like interpret some of those findings, focusing on the organism environment system, like Gibson says we should. So yeah, now I'm at U of T in a department with no ecological psychologists, trying to bring some ecological principles to my PhD work, kind of threading that needle, and trying to spread some of the interesting insights and principles from the field.
Brilliant, thank you. I think actually reading Gibson is going to probably be a theme of how to get hooked into this. I think that's going to be a good start. Brilliant. So, who we got next? Vicente, if you, I'll touch you. So, Vicente Raja is a research fellow at the philosophy department of the University of Murcia in Spain. Is that right? Am I saying that right? And external associated faculty at Robyn Institute, so one that just mentioned. And so his research lies at the intersection of philosophy, cognitive science, and neuroscience. And he's mostly focused at the moment on the pursuit of a radical embodied neuroscience, which I'm personally finding very exciting to watch develop and unfold. So Vicente, if you want to come in and tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, thanks. My path was a little bit weird because I got to Gibson before I got to mainstream, so to speak. You know, I read Gibson before I read Fodor or Pinker or whoever mainstream figure you want to think about. I was, well, after I was for some years a computer scientist, I came back to college to study philosophy. And there, during my junior year, the third year of my bachelor's, I went to the US to Virginia as an exchange student, and then I read The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. So to me, kind of the first step was not James Gibson, but William James, which actually makes sense when you understand the history of the ecological approach, right? So after reading that, I came back to Murcia, and I needed to write a honor thesis, and I met a philosopher of the cognitive sciences here called Paco Calvo. And I talked to him about James, and he said, I know nothing about James, but have you read Gibson? And then I remember that he gave me Gibson 1979, Harry Heft's 2001 book on the ecological psychology in context, and a chapter in a book that was written by Michael Richardson, Kevin Shockley, Mike Tarvey too, Mike Riley, which is called 6 Principles of Ecological Psychology. And after I read these 3 things, I think like Robyn said, I started reading everything else through those lenses. So actually, when I got to the mainstream, it already didn't make much sense to me anymore, you know. So I was already contaminated from the very beginning. So that was kind of my story.
Excellent. That always cracks me. It's a very unusual journey, I think, as we'll discover, to actually hit Gibson first. That's awesome. And it's good. I'm glad we get to fold William James into this as well. So if you're interested in this, you get to at least read some interesting people who are good writers. That's always fun. Excellent. Good. Thank you. So finally, I'll introduce Alexandra Paxton. who is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychological Sciences and the Center for the Ecological Study of Perception and Action, CESPA, at University of Connecticut. So she's taking an ecological and dynamical approach to communication and social interaction, to very complex topics, actually, that are well and truly time that we got into, given the ecological and the embodied sort of commitments that we have. So she's particularly interested in understanding how aspects of context, things like interaction goals, relationship history, physical spaces, change those moment-to-moment interconnectedness of interacting individuals' behavior, cognition, and emotion. So with that, I'll pass over to Alex, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah, of course. So I love all of these different sort of origin stories because they're so different. I did my undergrad and was very kind of traditional psychological, approach. And it wasn't until graduate school that I started to get into the post-cognitive sort of approaches. It was much more of a pluralist sort of post-cognitive area at my graduate institution. And so from that, it was very fully dynamical, but also very open to other ideas. So it was a little bit open to questioning and open to a bunch of different ideas. And through that, I got a lot of experience with different threads of embedded, embodied, situated cognition that come from different sorts of strains beyond just straight ecological approaches. So for me, the ecological approach was kind of embedded into the graduate education, and it was something that was done in such a way and introduced in such a way that they explicitly talked about the contrast between traditional cognitivist approaches and the post-cognitive approach. And this was even though my PhD was in cognitive and information sciences. It was very much open to these ideas. So I love seeing the cognitive science group here being interested in ecological approaches rather than seeing them as opposed, which can sometimes be a way that people present these different areas. And given my interest in social interaction and being interested in the way that multiple people connect with one another, it makes sense to see things, as Robyn said, kind of the organism environment interaction. It just kind of clicks, right? When you're thinking about how multiple people are connected with one another, that is sort of when you take that sort of step, it helps, I think, really flesh out those commitments that we have to understanding, to me, especially social dynamics. So that was kind of how I got started.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting watching it's interesting that you guys have had quite different journeys actually in some respect, which is quite nice. And that's certainly quite representative, I think, of how people tend to show up in this field. I mean, I certainly, I was just thinking back while you guys were talking about how I got involved in this, and literally until I got to grad school, Gibson was just this guy that occasionally showed up in the textbooks as, oh, by the way, there was this crazy guy called Gibson. And I'm having this experience again at the moment, actually, when I'm teaching cognitive psychology to students here. The textbook that we use for part of the course does talk a little bit about Gibson, but I've actually had to include in my lectures now a little note about how badly they're talking about Gibson and about how much they're not really dealing with it. So it's nice that actually it's out there now. And actually, one of the nice things that's developing is an ecological psychology undergraduate level textbook has now been written and is out. And I know that there's another one being planned that's very explicitly doing the compare and contrast across theories of perception, which I think will be fantastic. And it'll really open up these things so that people will come to this a little bit more purposefully, which I think is fantastic. So that's great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work through a few questions, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail. So I'm going to give the individual speakers a little bit more time. If they say something particularly interesting that I desperately want to jump in on, I will do so because I can. But otherwise, I'm mostly just going to let them kind of talk. for the people in the audience, if you do have questions, feel free to drop stuff in the chat. We'll keep one eye on it, and we're not necessarily going to have the time to get to everything, but if anything comes up, then I might introduce it as a way of keeping the topic moving forward. Just the other thing, the other sort of framing I'd like to make is that the panel, we had a discussion before we came together and to do this, and one of the things we're really trying to communicate today is the idea that ecological psychology has a very feisty history where we've been trying for a long time to create space, and we've been picking fights and pitching ourselves in opposition to a lot of things, and we are opposed to a lot of things, and that's quite important. But one of the really key things I think that we're going to try and communicate to you, the audience, is that the ecological approach has a lot to offer a lot of different people and a lot of different topics. And we're really looking to tell a bit of a story now about where the field is at as we try now to reconnect with some things that historically we've left alone, things like neuroscience and more complex tasks involving multiple people and all those kinds of things. So what I'll do is I'll go to Vicente first of all, and kind of the question is really just tell us a little bit about your key area of interest. Tell us about what you're up to right now, some of the things that you're doing. And in particular, what I want you to do is just tell us about what does your research look like, given that you are taking an ecological approach? And if there are differences and then points of connection, that would be fantastic to draw attention to. So I'll pass over to Vicente now.
Yeah, I live a life in which I'm kind of 80% a philosopher, 20% an ecological psychologist, I guess, or even I was going to say a cognitive scientist writ large, but I guess an ecological cognitive scientist. So my main area of research, actually, since I started my PhD 10 years ago now, is trying to develop an ecological neuroscience, or some other people call it a Gibsonian neuroscience. I like something more like radical embodied neuroscience because of this idea that we kind of trying to bring together insights from different places, and radical embodiment includes more people than just ecological psychology, but it is fundamentally ecological. So this is my main thing. I try to make sense both theoretically and empirically of how an ecological neuroscience is, or how an ecological neuroscience would look like. To do so, I wrote a whole dissertation on how to understand the notion of resonance, which is the kind of the main metaphor within the ecological approach to understand what's the role of the brain in cognitive activities and in the control of perception and action. Gibson talks about resonance more than it is acknowledged sometimes, but not very deeply though. So it always remains at the metaphorical, conceptual level. And my task during my dissertation was to try to operationalize the concept and to try to understand how that means, so to speak, formally. So then we can actually try to test it in experiments. So I'm not completely sure how deep should I go on why I know or why I think resonance is, because to say so I have to say that what ecological information is, and there are like a few bits.
I think a little bit of that would be really appropriate, actually, because the first thing I wrote down was resonance to what, and that's a key part of, I think, of the project. So okay, I think if you can give us a little bit of that would be amazing.
So, what is ecological information? I'm going to try to put it as simple as I can. If you read some of the technical stuff, ecological information is related to the evolution of the geometrical and topological properties of the low energy fields that surround the organism. And that's a mouthful, right? It's not that clear what that means, but basically it means that organisms are always surrounded in the regular niches they live in by light and by air and by chemicals that come from flowers and from cars and that kind of things, right? And these these energies that surround organisms have a structure, and the structure actually is nothing very fancy, right? You know, light comes from the light source and bounces off from all the walls and the ground and all the objects in the environment and reverberates there, so that in some places you have more light than in another place. Like most likely in all the rooms you are, there's more light on top of the table than under it, right? Just because how it is structured. So that structure, importantly, holds a kind of lawful relationship with the layout of the environment due basically to the laws of optics, right? Light travels in straight lines and bounces up with some angles and that kind of stuff. So when the perceptual system of an organism that moves around there transform that structure or make this structure available to it in different ways, that structure can carry information about the environment. And that's what we call ecological info. Especially there are some geometrical properties of that structure that we call invariant. That means that they remain kind of the same as we move around, that we take to be the variables of ecological information. So once that is there, we can actually describe behavior in terms of that information. That is, we can see how the presence of that ecological variables in the surroundings of the organism actually constrain the way they go ahead with their behavior and the way they control it. A way to say this is that the organism environment dynamics are constrained by ecological information. That's kind of a standard view on how to understand behavior within the ecological approach. So what is resonance then? We can, if we accept that there are also brain dynamics, and you know that there's neural activity that changes in time, and we all accept that. I mean, we all mean all ecological psychologists and all cognitive scientists, right? That's kind of I think I claim, at least, or my interpretation of what resonance is that the neural dynamics of an organism are resonating to ecological information when the same ecological variable that constrains the organism environment dynamics also constrains neural dynamics, such that like you can describe organism environment dynamics in terms of ecological information, you can also describe neural dynamics in terms of ecological info. So this has been my main theoretical work for the last 6 or 7 years. And actually, one benefit of this kind of operationalization is that you can actually test that, right? So you can put a person within an environment and try to measure whether the same ecological variable that is at play in the behavior itself, it's also at play in the neural dynamics. And I've been trying to do that actually during the last 3 years or so. I've been working on a experimental setup that can help us to measure this kind of thing. So last summer, I finally was able to gather data within that kind of setup. I spent the summer at the mobile brain imaging lab in the Technical University of Berlin, and our setup was a combination of a virtual reality environment in which the participants were able to behave in a task that is very well known within the ecological approach, which is called the interception task. Basically, they were catching an object that was approaching them, and they were also wearing an EEG. So we were able to basically measure some aspects of the brain dynamics while they were doing that. It was important to be in VR, so we had control of all the variables of the visual input, so to speak. It was also important that it was a mobile EEG, so they were able to move around in a kind of free way. Of course, there are always some limits, right? And we were actually measuring brain activity, the movement of the hand, eye movement, head movement too. So now we have a huge set of multimodal data in which we are going to try to explore the influence of ecological information at all those scales. So not just hand, but also eyes and head and brain. And this is basically what I've been doing most of my time. That's most of my work, but I am also a philosopher, and I like the history and philosophy of ecological psychology. So I've been trying to make sense of some of the philosophical maneuvers Gibson made in order to reframe psychology, its connection to William James, as we have been talking before too. And actually, I'm just finishing a short introductory book on ecological psychology for the Cambridge Elements series, in which we actually try to, to present the main aspects, both historical, philosophical, and empirical, of the ecological approach in 70 pages. And we are trying to aim this to also undergrads and grad students. So we are in some ways we are trying to counter the influence of the textbook that Andrew has to use. So you can have another one that actually tries to explain the ecological approach in a better way, right? So yeah, that's what I do.
That's really cool. Thank you. I'm just going to, there's a couple of follow-ups. I think there were some really nice sort of facts. Excuse me while my lights come off. There's some really nice facts of and realities of the empirical setup that you have to engage with by virtue of the fact that you're taking an ecological approach, and the fact that you're trying to make neuroscience very seriously and deeply embodied as well. So you aren't just measuring brain activity, you're measuring brains in moving bodies, and you're measuring the moving bodies in contexts of particular tasks and things. So that's quite an interesting, I think, it seems really obvious to me as an ecological psychologist that if you're going to do that, that would be the way to do it. But there's two things there. One is that it's not the most obvious way to go about studying the brain for a lot of people. And I would imagine that's really hard to set up and to interpret that kind of data. So just so that I guess the question, the sort of the follow-up I was thinking about focusing in on that, what's it like to deal with that much data and run those experiments? And if you're looking at the data as it's coming out, what's it able to tell you that you do think that's different?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few considerations here. Yes, I mean, one of them is that, and I think resonates to the spirit of this thing, which is like, as ecological psychologists, we cannot hope to just go to a cognitive neuroscience lab and say, okay, you have to close all of this, you have to throw all these things away, and let's do this, right? This is, I would say, even delusional, right? I mean, there are people that approach these things with other way, with other theoretical tools that we might disagree, but they actually have the labs and the expertise for the data analysis of all that kind of stuff, and nothing. So one thing is to try to go there to the cognitive neuroscience lab and to convince them to do something more ecological. In my case, it was easy because the mobile brain imaging and the mobile EEG community are already quite ecological in a wider sense. They have a lot of they have a lab constructed around movement, right? And how to study the brain in kind of more naturalistic situation in which we actually move around, right? So in my case, I had the luck to go to that kind of lab. So many of the things there were already in place, right? So they already have the mobile EEGs, they already had the virtual environments, they already have the mocap, the eye tracking. So actually, to do so there was relatively easy in terms of the experimental setup, but just because they were doing already that, right? So one thing, cognitive neuroscientists can be allies, right? Can be allies, right? Can work with us, right? We don't need to close their labs or no, we can work with them, and that's what we did. In that case, I guess, and Robyn will tell us afterwards, the fMRI is a little bit more tricky, but still possible, I guess. So that was one thing. So the next step is the data analysis. This is where the ecological contribution, in my case, was more clear and is more clear because the cognitive neuroscientists are at the mobile EEG lab at the Technical University of Berlin are not analyzing data in terms of ecological information, in terms of invariance and that stuff. And this is what I think we can contribute with this theory of resonance. Still, we need to rely a lot in their expertise, right? I mean, they have a whole pipeline in which they use a lot of methods and AI to basically clean and denoise all these multimodal data. I think we are good in time series analysis, in behavioral data. I think, like Andrew said, we are already, the ecological approach is already in a mature stage. So we know the things that we can do well, but we don't need to be good in denoising EEG, right? So we are doing that right now. I'm learning a lot about that. And the next step is to try to look for the ecological variable. We are going to start with time to contact because it's the best studied in this kind of experiment, the best well-known one, easy to find actually, right? And that kind of thing. But there's this open question on where are we going to find it? There are all these EEG bands. There are all these sensors. We can create dipoles or not. You know, there are many opportunities for data analysis. Are we going to go to the temporal spectrum, to the power? You know, like there are many ways in which we can look at this. So the way I'm seeing that now is fully exploratory. We are going to try many things, not because we don't know what we are looking for, because our constraint is actually very strong. It's tau. So it's, you know, it's this variable. It's not any other variable. It's that one. But the wealth of the brain data is so big and so unexplored from the ecological approach that we can look for this very particular thing in many places, and we will. So that's I think that it's that the focus on the ecological variable. It's what makes this different, even within a community that is already very close to our own ideas.
Cool, thank you very much. That's really interesting. I like the idea of it because we've kind of got these two very established and mature fields, neuroscience and the fields of analysis and all the things that they can do. And the ecological approach, you know, has a maturity on certain things, right? We have a lot to offer each other, and it's clear that, you know, working together and talking together is now producing the opportunity to try and go looking for something new, which is very cool. Awesome, great, thank you very much. Right, I'm going to talk to Alex now, if you want to tell us a little bit about what you're up to, what your research kind of interests are, what you're primarily interested in, and what the program looks like, given that you are taking an ecological approach to doing it.
Yeah, I think for me, given that I'm interested in understanding social dynamics and interpersonal communication, one of the benefits of really embracing the ecological approach is that you get to treat the system with the complexity that it deserves. Instead of assuming that our interlocutors or the people with whom we're having a conversation or the people with whom we're interacting are somehow something static that needs to be transformed by the brain in order for us to understand them, we can really start to see the richness of other people and the way that seeing other people as part of our environment changes the opportunities for action that we have in these social domains. So the way that I started doing this was trying to explore how different interaction contexts as defined by goals that we have or types of conversations that we have will change the movement dynamics between people. So I come from this from an area that's often known as interpersonal synchrony or interpersonal coordination, sometimes known by alignment or mimicry or the chameleon effect. Has a bunch of different names, and that's because it comes from a bunch of different areas, many areas being more cognitivist aligned rather than kind of this more ecological approach. But in looking at that, my foray into ecological dynamics in that comes from an understanding or wanting to understand how different sorts of communication dynamics might change based on the way that we change aspects of that interaction. Oh no, am I frozen? It looks like I'm frozen. Can you see me? Okay, great. Sorry, thanks. So I started out by trying to understand not just the endpoint of the system, because this is something that ecological psychologists get as being so dynamically aligned. By understanding that change, that interaction, that exploration of the system is so critical to understanding the behavior. And something that we get as a toolbox is these dynamical ideas. So rather than looking at the way that the system ends itself, the snapshot of the end of whatever it is we're studying, we really need to understand where it starts, how it progresses along the way, and where it ends for us to be able to understand that. So in a lot of interpersonal, kind of aligned areas, social dynamics, you might ask someone a survey about something at the end, or have someone watch an interaction and then produce one rating or something at the end of that. And while there is an understanding that, there's something happening as people are interacting, the way that the data analysis tended to go was a little bit reductionistic in trying to do that. And some of that is also a technological limitation. And just like, mobile EEG opens up new opportunities for ecological neuroscience or, radical embodied neuroscience, so too do other forms of technological innovation open up opportunities for other areas that we can, again, appreciate fully the system as it emerges, as it kind of unfolds over time. Because, if you think about how before the advent of really good, widely accessible technology to track human movement over time would be, there were people in the 1960s who were taking videos of interactions and looking frame to frame, measuring all of the changes that they were doing of this videotape which I can't even imagine the amount of time, the amount of effort, the amount of energy involved, like that it's mind boggling. And of course, not many people are going to have the opportunity to do that. Then you move into, you know, sort of motion trackers that would be requiring very intensive setups and very costly sorts of trackers in the 90s and aughts, you know, kind of thinking about what people were required to do that. The kind of cost, the barrier to entry was really high. Whereas when I was starting grad school, sort of these computer-based analyses were starting to become available because of easily accessible digital video, because of more improved computational power and processing power for computing. So as a result, when these technologies can change and when we look to other, you know, the technological fields for opportunities for us with our ecological lens, we can see opportunities for us to more fully realize our own commitments. So for me, bringing two people into the lab, rather than, again, having people do a single rating at the end or having someone watch them and track, you know, frame to frame with the video cameras, I was able to have people have these conversations, record them with a video camera, and then use computer vision techniques to extract in, you know, in kind of this time series of movement as people were engaging with one another in these naturalistic interactions. And so for me, this sort of approach that I wanted to understand was, rather than just taking this sort of approach that had been an outgrowth of the way that people had studied interpersonal synchrony before, tended to be more kind of friendly interactions or positively valenced interactions. They tended to have this idea that people would become more similar over time, and that was sort of an inexorable outgrowth of two people being in the same room in the same space. And there's really lovely studies that support that idea, that if you put people in the same room with a positively valenced or no interaction goals at all, or trying to do something together, that they will become more similar. But really, I was interested in understanding very ecological, in kind of an ecological or dynamical approach, what happens when you change facets of that and then see how those different initial conditions of the system, those different opportunities for movement, for action, can change that. So I put people in the room and you know, tried to see what happens when they have an argument with one another, and how argument as a context changes the way that people interact with one another. So that was one of the that was the earliest study that I did in this domain. And from that, I've tried to cultivate more of a line of research where we look at some of these different markers of interaction, or these real-time measures of interactions, and understanding those time series, to see how when we put people in kind of similar settings, but we change key facets of that, what happens to that? Because again, if we're looking at these variance and invariance in our social settings, what do those look like? What can we change about an interaction setting and see the same thing? What do we change and then see something very different? Because we can understand, again, with these dynamical approaches, by marrying those to the ecological approaches, we can see that there are some changes to a system that will lead to you know, no change, and very robust systems and very robust organism and social interactions. And there are other things that we can make a little change, and then suddenly there's a huge difference in how that goes. And so one of the things that I am excited about is people continuing to push those areas and seeing where those lie, what those are, because again, they've been this area has been dramatically, social dynamics has been dramatically underexplored in an ecological approach, partially because creating these opportunities to study them under these time evolving, very thoughtfully controlled settings have been limited by our technological advances. So other stuff I'm kind of doing along the way, kind of carrying this in, you know, most recently I did a study that was similar, but we looked at, for example, what might be causing people to have different interactions during face-to-face versus video conference mediated, like Zoom interactions, right? Grounded not from some sort of representational view that there's something happening that's shaping that, but really it's the ecological information about our partner's movement in the limited sort of square that you're seeing in Zoom that could be influencing this, and that there are other kind of facets that it could interact with. So kind of bringing that new lens to existing questions and allowing you to really, I think, you know, the idea of parsimony, or the simplest explanation, rather than adding all of these additional representations of representations. I'm modeling you, modeling me, modeling you. If we just say, no, we're leaving our fingerprints on the world around us, and that is something that we can detect and that we can easily kind of leave for other people. That is something that we don't have to do this additional stuff, because it's there. It lives in the environment in this very real way. I hope that was answering kind of your question. I feel like I lost some of the threads there, so feel free to follow up if I miss anything.
No, thanks, Alex. That was really cool. I think one of the things I really liked that was emerging in there, and it's a key ecological move, actually, that I talk to people about, that distinction of being less focused on the outcome and much more interested in process. That's a key ecological shift in your thinking that has to happen before you are thinking ecologically, I think. And it's less, because, you know, and especially when you study, you know, in the boring context of, say, a skilled movement, you know, if I'm reaching for my coffee mug, I can measure that. And as a general rule, people successfully pick up their coffee mug, right? It works. And so, but all the interesting mileage that's come out has been looking at the process. How do the kinematics unfold over time? How are they varying, that repetition without repetition idea, etc. And it's really, I think you're in a really rich field of where that focus on process is utterly crucial over forward. And it's the other thing that was occurring to me, having very briefly brushed up against the social coordination, interpersonal coordination literature with a PhD student a few years back. One of the things that was really, I think everybody wanted to be able to be talking about that aspect. That's the thing that actually everybody seems to be interested in, but then the experiments kind of weren't living up to that ambition. But one of the nice things from everything that we're talking about, and one of the things I think that we have, is the ecological approach provides a very natural way to talk about exactly these things. Does that seem fair to you, Alex?
Oh, most definitely. And I feel as though, although ecological psychology has built its expertise in visual domains and in movement domains very, very solidly over, you know, since Gibson, right? That foundation, the principles that those areas require to really live out the ecological approach, it naturally, I think, flows into the social domain, right? If you are going to say that the information that you are detecting through engaging with the environment and how that's guiding your actions, the information, you know, the opportunities for movement that are happening, that is naturally going to, I think, ally with the unfolding discovery of your interaction partner, of their beliefs, of their understandings, of the co-creation of that interaction space, right? There's, I think, an understanding in social domains, even while there is often a measurement problem, because, you know, social psychology isn't one of the most funded domains, so it is much more financially possible for you to give someone a survey that they fill out, right? That costs very little. But there is still an understanding that there is something happening. And so when you go to a social psychologist and you say, hey, those intuitions that you have about something happening, I can give you a toolkit. I can give you a language. I can give you a framework for understanding that, and for really appreciating the fact that what I do fundamentally shapes the opportunities for actions for what you do in a way that's not just sort of lip service, but is deeply understanding that. I think that there are a lot of allies that we can, that you know, in social psychology, that we can recruit by, again, taking this approach where we reach out a hand to someone, where we build a bridge to them, and we explain in ways that are accessible, and not kind of reducing the clarity, the intensity of our ideals, but instead making a persuasive case, taking a page from social psychology, right? Making a persuasive case for the utility it can give them.
Yeah, yeah, really cool. I think that's definitely the big pitch, for the ecological approach these days, and it's playing out really nicely in that domain. I think that's awesome. Great. Well, Robyn, let's move to you now. So, if you want to tell us a little bit about your research, what your interests are, and what your day-to-day looks like, given that you're doing things ecologically.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Vicente and Alex. Going last has an advantage. There's lots of threads that I get to pick out. So to kind of frame what I'm doing. So I think within the context of this panel, I'm at the earliest stage of my career. So I'm going to be pointing to a lot of work other people have done and also things I'm starting to do and kind of the research program I'm beginning to develop. So broadly, I'm interested in understanding the relationship between event perception and memory of events from an more ecological and like dynamical point of view. And I'm an empirical scientist as well, like Alex, although I know a lot of philosophers like Vicente. But I think like event perception and memory is one of the more difficult things to do from an ecological point of view. I think it does fall like Alex was saying with like within the social sphere. I think there are some principles that can be applied and that follow nicely from the ecological approach into these domains, especially event perception. But it's a matter of like scaling up and like extending the approach, right? So Vicente was talking about I'm super glad he explained ecological information earlier on. So there's that nice foundation. So if from the ecological perspective, if something is perceived, if we're able to perceive it and change our behavior due to that, the ecological information must exist somewhere within these energy arrays, right? So a lot of research within event perception shows that we do perceive event structure. And so the challenge becomes like beyond tau, beyond like small events that you could characterize like a baseball passing by you, that is an event too. Is there information in these arrays like that specify these broader things that are happening in our environments? So there's two, that's a big question. I don't have an answer to that question yet. But that is one thing I'm interested in. But there's two main things from the ecological approach that I think, as Alex was saying, a lot of the social psychologists, like they want to know the process, right? Not just the outcome. And it's the same within memory research and cognitive neuroscience, fMRI. Like they understand the limitations in terms of like realism and understanding the context and the history of the system. But like how do we go about understanding that? Within fMRI, the issue of realism is most palpable, sorry. Especially in terms of like allowing participants to interact with real objects, and then movement. And movement is not something we're going to be able to overcome in fMRI because movement is the death of the bold signal. Having now gotten my hands really dirty with like fMRI pre-processing and denoising, and part of what I've been doing so far is trying to build like a more robust like denoising pipeline. It is tricky. So there's a hard technological limitation there. But on the other hand, there's a reason people use fMRI. And it's because it is the only way in healthy human subjects you're able to start to get at what's going on, especially in the middle of the brain, right? Over time with the kind of, obviously there's not a lot of temporal precision, which is important for understanding dynamics, but there's quite a lot of like spatial coverage and spatial precision with it. So that's why the tool's used. But how can we overcome this? So I would like to point to some other researchers' work, in particular work by Jacqueline Snow and Jody Cullum. Jody is at Western University. She taught me my first neuroscience course as well, so huge influence there as well. And they've kind of developed this approach to cognitive neuroscience they call immersive neuroscience, and they're trying to bring realism into fMRI and cognitive psychology tasks, even behaviorally, and to close the perception action loop within tasks within the fMRI. So in terms of like realism, I'm going to share my screen briefly, because I think this is most effective when you see some of the setups that they've developed. So this is the setup for the fMRI that Jody and Jacqueline Snow kind of developed. Obviously still quite artificial and constrained for an ecological psychologist. But importantly, they developed this apparatus, this turntable, where they were able to present real objects, obviously not metal ones, but real objects into the scanner within like grasping distance of the participants. And within this paper, they showed that this classic fMRI effect, the fMRI suppression effect, whereby when you repeatedly present the same picture of an object, the bold response, so the fMRI indication of brain activity, kind of attenuates over time. But they found that when they presented real objects in the scanner, that effect kind of disappeared. And it kind of points to the importance of like not necessarily assuming that just because something applies to a picture, it applies to a real object in terms of like the way we interact or the way we perceive it, the way our brain responds to it. Yeah, because the brain doesn't just take pictures of things and process. It engages with the real world, with tangible objects. This is some other work. I'll point to this first. This is a project, my first empirical project I worked on with Vicente and Mike, where we looked at the categorization of objects, pictures, and word names in a similarity judgment paradigm, whereby participants place objects closer together if they're seen as more similar, or further apart if they're seen as less similar. And then you measure that and can construct these similarity matrices. And we found that pictures and words, in terms of their similarity judgments, were not as different as objects compared to pictures and compared to words. And when we did like a cluster analysis on this, an exploratory cluster analysis, we interpreted that the objects seemed to be more categorized based on like their action, opportunities, or affordances. That was our interpretation of that data. In terms of memory, Jacqueline Snow has done a couple of really cool studies where one of the things I love about when you start applying like ecological principles to cognitive psych experiments is that you get to be like really creative in the physical world. You're not just like designing stimulus presentations on a screen, although there is a use for that. You get to build cool things like this turntable, you know, kind of become part carpenter. But here they built this apparatus and were able to present either pictures or real objects to the participants. And they found that real objects were significantly more memorable in terms of episodic memory recall and recognition than 2D images. And in their most recent paper, they showed that this effect was attenuated by like physical distance in terms of the object condition, but not the picture condition. So they interpreted that as memory being both quantitatively different for 2D images versus real objects, and also like qualitatively different too, in the way they interpret it, in the way they're represented or processed, because they're still working within cognitivist framework, but in a much more ecological way. And I think this points to what Alex was saying as well about, and Vicente, I think, was mentioning it too, about how there's like allies within the field. I think Jody Cullum and Michael Anderson's collaborations and their relationship at Western University is a great example of that. Yeah, Jody didn't become, totally a Gibsonian through her conversations with Mike. And she was thinking about a lot and doing a lot of this before she and Mike met, but like they were able to like influence each other and have this collaborative relationship, which I think really influenced the way I want to try to build bridges across these fields as well. So those are some of the cool apparatuses in terms of like physical realism within the fMRI and within cognitive psych tasks. I think another key principle that I'm trying to bring into my work is the importance of context and the history of the system as well. And Alex obviously is doing a lot of work on that in the social domain. So I'm trying to do approach this and understand this in terms of the brain dynamics of event perception. So luckily, a lot of event perception and memory fMRI work uses more naturalistic stimuli already. They present like movie narratives and videos, which doesn't close the perception action loop, but it's a richer stimulus, right? For technical reasons, a lot of this work is done on group averaged fMRI data, which, because the bold signal is complex and messy, right? And compounds like movement are really difficult to deal with. So one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm taking one of the algorithms for like finding neural event boundaries, so widespread shifts in brain dynamics that occur around human judged like boundaries between or transitions between events in these narratives. I'm trying to validate that for the use on individual brain data, which is really tricky. And we're in the process of that right now, but we do have some really good preliminary results so far, so we're hopeful about that. And by doing that, then you're able to ask questions. Once you have those individualized event boundaries, you're able to ask questions like, what do these boundaries correspond to, right? Is there some kind of higher order, like invariant information that is constraining these boundaries that occur across the cortical hierarchy that we see in this data? What is happening in terms of the participants' like attentional states, in terms of their neuromodulatory dynamics? That's something I'm really looking at. There's a lot of research showing that changes in neuromodulators like acetylcholine, which originates deep in the brain, that's why you need fMRI, and like has projections throughout the cortex, has both a widespread and also very temporally precise effect on the brain that's associated with attentional states. And so what I'm testing right now is, can these individual differences in neural event boundaries and also like behavioral event boundaries be explained by different changes or different acetylcholine dynamics in the individuals? So this is getting quite neuroscience-y. But the idea, I'm inspired a lot by Scott Kelso's coordination dynamics perspective for this, seeing acetylcholine as kind of a control parameter for the event perception system at the level of the brain, right? I'm not saying we're automatons and acetylcholine levels going up and down are what's causing us to perceive events, right? That's not very ecological. But I'm starting with the brain because it's in a way easier with the availability of like open fMRI data sets. But the cool thing about acetylcholine is that there's work showing a relationship between, this is in mice, between midbrain cholinergic dynamics and neck movements associated with attention. So like bringing in that next level would be great once there's like an established understanding of what's going on in the brain. Although I know that's opposite to the way a lot of ecological psychology is done. But I'm also kind of at the same time looking at how this exploratory behavior, which is associated with like neck movements and moving, could have an effect on, like behaviorally, have an effect on memory for objects and events as well. I'm right now developing a design to extend some of Jacqueline Snow's work, and within like the memory paradigm with the turntable, adding like an exploration manipulation where the participants like walk around, to adding that agency and adding that like, and I think it will improve their memory for those objects, even above and beyond that. That's my hypothesis, at least. It hasn't been tested yet. And one of the reasons why is also because of acetylcholine. We know that exploration is related to high levels of acetylcholine in the brain, which and high levels of acetylcholine affect the hippocampus by there being a greater input of information into the hippocampus during high acetylcholine states. So that was a lot, but I guess I'm trying to tie together a few pieces. Realism, trying to understand the brain dynamics at the individual level of analysis as it relates to events. So stay tuned.
Thanks. That's really cool. I say, as a slightly old-fashioned ecological psychologist, for the longest time, I really had my doubts as to whether or not fMRI was the kind of technology that would be of any use to us because of the technological limitations of having to lock people in, etc. But I remember encountering Cullinan Snow's stuff when it was first coming out, and your discussion now is just really, basically, I'm glad no one listened to me, because it's clearly sounding like, hey, like you made the point that fMRI is a key technology, right? It's everywhere in a neuroscience department. It's the thing that everybody uses. And so again, in terms of not telling people that they have to close their labs down, but going to them and asking if we can play and if we can work together and help, then finding ways to engage, take advantage of what that technology can do. And it's becoming really clear from the things you were saying that fMRI technology and the data that comes out is actually very rich and can tell us a great deal about some very interesting and really important facets. And I really think, so I always liked the stuff, just identifying the simple fact that interacting with a picture and interacting with the object are two actually completely different things, and the brain resonates to those in two completely different ways. And that's quite important given the centrality of images in their use in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience research. Just empirically demonstrating that difference is not just us being a bit weird, but it's actually really quite important, and that it has all these interesting kind of distributed consequences on memory and things like that. One follow-up question I was just thinking about. So you talked about closing the perception action loop and being able to do that. That's another really central ecological notion, that actually we're not just studying input and output, but we're actually interested in a loop, an ongoing loop of behavior that develops, and that's actually, we're interested in that because we think that that's how things really work, and if you're going to study it, you have to do that. And that's connecting up, there's been some high-profile papers like the Neuroscience Needs Behavior paper and a couple of. So one of the things I was curious about, and with your embedding in a fairly traditional department, how are people responding to the idea that an ecological approach, like we were talking like with Alex, we have that language, we have that orientation already, it's kind of baked in. How are people responding to and feeling like whether or not there's something for us to contribute?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, well, my department is great. For one, it is more of a traditional, very, very heavily like memory-based cognitive neuroscience department here at U of T. But both my advisor and the rest of the community are extremely collaborative and open-minded people. Like I can't speak highly enough about the department here. It's really an amazing environment for sharing some wacky ideas and seeing what lands. And so everyone's been, both in terms of like my fellow grad students and some of the faculty I've talked to, have been really open-minded towards some of these ideas. Because as I was saying and Alex was saying, like there is this intuition that like the history of the system matters, that like realism matters, that closing this perception action loop matters. But like how can we do that, right? Yeah, there's deep expertise, and I'm learning so much from the department, right, in terms of fMRI analyses and some kind of the established theory within memory and perception from their point of view. And so I don't think like my goal isn't to like convert everyone to the Church of Gibson. Like I don't like that. I don't like that approach. But just to like, I don't know, point to some really interesting, cool tools that are available that they can like easily incorporate into their current research programs to get closer to an ecological approach or a more ecological approach. One thing I like advocating for is this idea of like epistemic humility within psychological research, acknowledging we're such a young science when you look at the history of science. And so I think it does a disservice to the field to like pigeonhole ourselves into one theoretical approach or another. Obviously, individual labs, just because of like practical constraints, need to choose one and like follow that path. But like, I don't know, being open to exploring ecological approaches as well as traditional cognitive approaches, I think is most fruitful for our field. Explore that theory space more fully. So yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. I think that's one of the nice things I think we're trying to find is that it's not just us going out into the world and saying we have things of value for you, but I think one of the things that the ecological approach embodied in you guys' learning is that actually the world's got quite a lot to tell us about the stuff that they've been up to, and we don't have to reinvent a lot of these wheels, and that there's real added value in collaborating, which is good. And that's certainly, it's great to see that embodied, because like I say, you know, I had a fairly traditional ecological upbringing, and you know, was embedded in some of those early kind of more combative kind of approaches to things. And I think it's really healthy for us to recognize that there's all this added value out there. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. That was really cool. So I'm just going to turn to the next question, and I'll start with Alex. Kind of the next question is, what is it about the ecological approach that is compelling to you? And we were talking about this earlier. I guess the way to frame the question is, we've talked a little bit about how you got to being an ecological psychologist and what it looks like being an ecological psychologist. I guess so the question I just want all of you to briefly address is, what keeps you an ecological psychologist? What's compelling about it? What's rewarding? So Alex, start with you.
Yeah, I think some of this I think I already touched on, so apologies if I sound a bit repetitive. I feel like ecological psychology really, as someone interested in social dynamics, really gives me the opportunity to see my phenomenological experience of social interaction reflected in my scientific practice, because I feel this deep interconnection with other people through our social interaction. I feel the pull of my thoughts, my feelings, my behaviors with another person in this way. That feels much more deeply intertwined in the creation of a new system using the sort of dynamical language. And I use dynamical and ecological a lot because I feel like they're hand in glove in a lot of ways. I know you can be one without the other, but for me, they're just, again, just so they're just so much of a part of everything that I use them together. I really feel like when I enter a new social space or when I'm in an interaction with another person, I feel that. But a lot of times with social psychology and even, you know, cognitive psychology and these traditional approaches, it's just sort of a mechanistic, you know, boxes and arrows sort of approach where I just, you know, kind of am nudged a little bit. I get a slightly different input rather than understanding that this is, no, I have porous boundaries as a system that changes and moves into these different states based on the different settings that I am. So I'm drawn to that from an individual level, and also just from an understanding of what we're doing is very nuanced in terms of when we're trying to understand social dynamics. There's a lot happening. There's a lot happening moment to moment. There's a lot of different behaviors that we're engaged, speech, language, emotion, you know, movement, all of these things. And I feel like ecological and dynamical really gives us the best chance that we have right now at capturing it, even though, again, like a lot of people doing these like as a result of the constraints of the technological and the analytical constraints that we have. Yes, we're only looking at one or two behaviors at a time. Yes, we're doing these sort of artificial interactions where we're kind of constraining people in labs so we can measure them. And so I recognize that we are not, like, we are a young science, as Robyn said. This is something that's new, and yes, we're not there yet, but I feel like it's the one that's getting us in the right direction most. And again, going back to Andrew, what you were saying about finding things that other people are doing, you know, it's why I think that ecological can also learn from larger scale data, big data, naturally occurring data. So repurposing the wealth of data that are just out there in the world, whether it's, you know, social media data, whether it's, you know, how people are engaging in traffic patterns through, you know, driving data and things like that, right? We can find a lot more about it even without the sort of experimental control, coupling the strong experimental control that we have in the lab with these naturally occurring data sets to understand the richness of the data, and really, again, with an understanding that the ecological dynamics, the ecological approach brings, we have something, I think, very different that we can even bring to those naturally occurring data contexts than we would get. So I think that's what keeps me here. The promise of it, the excitement of it, the sort of, to me, the fidelity to the phenomenon that I'm interested in studying.
Cool, thank you. I really like that enthusiasm for just the seeing the reality of it in your data. And I think it's, you know, having worked on, you know, boring tasks like finger wiggling and stuff, there are some days where you start to wonder about these things, and it is, I mean, but it is, I think there really is that excitement there, and that's really cool. Let's see, Robyn, can I pop back to you? And what's the thing that's keeping you hitting and wanting to head in this direction? What's the...
Yeah, well, beyond the fact that I think my personality has always been a little bit counterculture, beyond getting into like psychoanalytics of who I am, I find this approach compelling. I think because of something Alex, like the number one reason, because of something Alex mentioned in the first segment, and that's this idea of the fact that I think ecological explanations of things are more parsimonious, in the fact that they appeal to fewer entities in terms of when they try to explain a phenomenon. I'll use an example from what I'm studying, event perception. The classic view, or the dominant theory of how we perceive events, is that we kind of build up these event or situation models in our minds, and then we use those models and compare them to perceptual models of the world during ongoing activity, and kind of make inferences over these things. But that leads to a lot of questions about like how many models are there? Like there feels like an indefinite number of them. Where are these models in the brain data? You know, I was talking about these neural event boundaries earlier, and a really compelling result is within like this fMRI data of people watching narratives, like movies usually. There is this like nested hierarchical structure across the cortex from like B1 up to like the PCC and like kind of default mode network areas, where there are more and shorter events like in the B1 and fewer and longer events like in terms of transitions and neural dynamics up in the PCC, and that these are the ones higher up are better matched to human annotated boundaries, and C, they're more invariant across modalities in terms of like whether it's an auditory narrative or a visual stimulus, and they're also the ones that are like recapitulated during free recall in many ways. So, but there's still a significant, the boundaries up in the PCC still exist in the B1. There's just more, there's like finer grained and faster dynamics happening in the B1. So I feel like an explanation of that in terms of ecological, like neural resonance or like constraining, like those boundaries, I think might correspond to some kind of invariant event structure information that constrains the brain dynamics across the cortex. This is an alternative interpretation of data that exists. And I think I find it more compelling because it's simpler, it's more parsimonious. So that's one of the reasons why I find it compelling. And in the same way, you're able to then like describe that with tools like dynamical systems theory, and have the same set of tools and the same like language to then try to understand, oh, is the same information then constraining behavior, like Vicente was saying. And so it might seem weird that like this complicated calculus, like dynamical systems theory thing is like simpler in a way, but I think in terms of like the number of concepts that we need to like bridge these scales of analysis, it's simpler in my mind anyways. So that's the main reason why I'm still compelled by it. I also just think it's neat. I don't know. I enjoy thinking about things in this way. So I don't know if that's a super scientific answer, but like I find it fun. So
I think that counts as a perfectly sensible answer. I think a lot of the people I've engaged with who do get into this I think a chunk of it is that it is fun. But yeah, I think that's interesting. I think one of the things we do bring is just a critical eye to the way in which other people talk about how these things develop, and just from that slightly outsider perspective of just going, really? You need that piece? And that's, sometimes, and the answer might be yes, we do in fact need that piece, but I think it's really important that we have someone who asks that question, and that's part of the fun with being an ecological psychologist. I think it's just going, are you sure? Could we maybe get rid of that one? And I think that's really cool. Thank you. Vicente, what's keeping you in the gig?
Well, I think I'm going to repeat what Alex and Robyn has said with different words. Of course, it has this counterculture stuff. It has this thing, like, that is neat, is fun. It's cool to read. Gibson, actually, it's a very good writer, and you can engage very well, right? So that all those elements that are maybe not purely epistemological or purely scientific are there for sure. Also, I mean, it's coming from if you have some interesting math in general within psychology, ecological psychology is one of the most mathy places, so to speak. It's where you actually see models in that in that specific way. It's not like this paper. I'm sorry, I don't remember the authors, but it's something like psychology is the science of personal reports and finger movements, because it's all yes or no, right? In the thing. So this is what ecological psychology is not exactly, right? It's that with this focus on the process and not on the result and that stuff. But in a more epistemological way, I think there are two reasons. One is phenomenological and the other is explanatory. And I think they both have already pointed out by Alex and Robyn. The phenomenological one is that, for instance, as an illustration, I'm, as a philosopher, and I assume there are some philosophers in this room, I think the linguistic turn, this famous linguistic turn that happened in the 20th century philosophy, is absolutely damn. It's the worst thing that has happened to both analytical and continental philosophy ever, because analytical philosophers reduce experience to the propositional attitudes. So experience is the apple is red, which is it's poverty. You know, it doesn't really reflect the visual experience of seeing an apple, right? And for the continental ones, everything is text. And this really doesn't tell the kind of all the things that happens in any experience before we get to speak, right? Actually, most of our experience is not like, I move this leg now, then I move this other leg, then I see. No, it's, you know, it's a stream of consciousness. It's experience that we might not have words for it, actually, right? But it's rich because we face a rich world. And I think this is captured by ecological psychology to acknowledge the richness of experience and to take it at base and to try to make sense of it. For the cognitive world, the world is rich, but at some point when it hits your retina, it is poor. And then you have to enrich it afterwards, right? So it's kind of, it's the whole experience gets into the apple is red, and then you have to build up the experience. Again, I think this doesn't make justice to human experience. And I mean, and it's kind of an old point, you know, like the most of our experience doesn't have to do with this simple stuff, with these symbols and that kind of thing. This famous paper by Rodney Brooks, Elephants Don't Play Chess, right? This points to this kind of thing, to whatever happens before we get to play chess is super important. And I think this also captures the social realm, right? All our interactions, even during a conversation that doesn't happen with words, right? That happens with the posture, with right? I mean, of course, Alex knows way more than me about that, but this is one thing. Another thing, I think is similar to what Robyn said. In all the explanations that I read, remember afterwards, right? I read all those explanations after I got James and Gibson inside, right? It's like something is weird sometimes, right? It's never. I have the feeling that they are deceiving me, right? With this, oh, you perceive events because you have a model of those events, but where the hell that models come from? Like for the first time, oh, nobody knows, right? It's kind of this kind of thing, this kind of explanation that seems to always take some step towards something that we cannot explain. And that step is actually what you need to explain, right? I mean, to perceive an event boundary because you have a model of event boundaries is just, you know, it requires you to explain how you have a model of the event boundaries in the first time to perceive the event boundaries, kind of thing, right? So yeah, these two things. I think ecological psychology provides at least a plausible solution to these two things, to the acknowledgement of the richness, of the intrinsic richness of experience, and a way to explain that experience without their recurse to some entities that doesn't explain very well.
Awesome, thank you. I think one of the themes that's emerging is that ecological psychology is, we can be a critical friend to the rest of psychology, which I think, and we all need critical friends, right? It's nice to just have someone looking at what you're doing and just going, are you sure? Just because it's really useful to make yourself ask and answer the question, wait, do I really need this? And yeah, if the answer is yes, then knock yourself out. But if the answer is no, then that's quite important. So that's cool. Yeah, Alex, go for it.
I would like to also point out, I think that being helpfully critical is also a sort of a value of ecological psychologists among one another, right? We're not just a critical friend to cognitivists, we're also critical friends to other ecological psychologists. I think that as we move forward, it is something that we do just for people who aren't familiar with the community. I don't want them thinking that we're only criticizing other people. We also criticize ourselves. I like that.
Some of the rougher reviews I've ever had come from other ecological psychologists in papers and in grants and that kind of stuff.
Look, I said I was sorry about that review, but I was trying to be helpful, Yeah, but I think that's really important. I think that's one of the other things to remember is that because we are such a radically different way of thinking and conceptualizing what it is that people are up to when they do things, I think, we do have that advantage, that slightly outsider perspective of just being able to just ask those questions. And I think they're healthy questions for the field of psychology in general to be asking, including us, right? We have to ask and answer those questions ourselves. That's great. Cool. So we're doing really well. Just as a last kind of thing, just to kind of finish up, we just kind of wanted to finish with a little bit of a focus on the future. And so I wanted to ask the members of the panel, what's the next thing you hope that someone will tackle in the near future? What's the next big topic? What's the next experiment? What would you love if somebody just did it? And just because you're really curious to see how it would go, and it's time that we got into it. So Vicente, let's start with you.
I think it's not that I'm personally super interested in that, but I think the next step for ecological psychologists, and we are starting seeing that, is machine learning in general, neural networks, AI, that kind of thing. I've done a little bit of work on that, but people like Ben Fallendice are already developing some cool neural network stuff. And I think this is going to be happening. I hope ecological psychology also goes more into the cultural realm, kind of, both in the political and in the social realm, like acknowledging that there are psychologists around the world, that not all of us are weird, right? White, European, blah blah blah. So I think this is going to happen. I hope ecological psychology continues going to the neuroscience thing. At least I'm going to try to. And of course, Robyn will too. And I think that it's the future, but it's happening now. I think we are starting to get better to communicate to students, right? We have, as Andrew said at the beginning, new resources, a new textbook. Our future as a field or as a framework that is still able to attract people and to attract funding, because in the end we need to eat and that kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's not to convince Freestone or Pinker about anything. They have their thing. We need to convince the students, right? To talk to grad students, to undergrads like here, and to try to show that, hey, you can use ecological psychology for your own work. And yeah, these are the things I hope keep happening in the next few years.
Brilliant, thank you. Robyn.
Yeah, it was difficult. It was difficult to decide. There's so many, especially within the realm of like an ecological approach to memory or some of these like broader things. There's just like more open questions than closed. So like I'm gonna go with a broad question. Like, is is a non-representational, is an ecological account of memory even possible? I know Alex mentioned that like your lab is doing some memory research from an ecological point of view as well, and I would actually love to talk to you about that at some point. But like, is it even possible? Gibson spoke a little bit, like wrote a little bit about memory, although he kind of like left that to the side a bit. But in one 1966 paper by him on like the problem of temporal order and stimulation, I think it's called, he kind of draws on Lashley's ideas of resonance. He talks about like this process of attunement and points to this idea of like perception being extended and not being confined to this like razor's edge of a retinal image instantaneously entering the system, right? It's continuous, it's ongoing. And kind of the fact that perception might lead into memory. He provocatively is like, you know, memory is information that lasts like a lifetime. How much more invariant can you get? Like, kind of thing. That was kind of his approach, right? And I find some of those ideas compelling, but at the same time, like he talks about representation as in like pictures are representations of objects, movies are representations of, so like representations exist. And it's really hard, like thinking about memory to think about like these aren't things that exist anywhere but like within you. You might get triggered by some kind of smell is a big one, or image or whatever, and then you're all of a sudden like back in that experience, although imperfectly. But that experience isn't happening around you, whether it's just in your brain or in your brain and your body. A lot of like work on the psychology of trauma, I think, kind of dovetails nicely with this idea in terms of how memory can be embodied. But like, is it even, I don't even know if it's possible. I think that might be one area that notions of a representation or a focus on the internal, even if it's not just the brain, but like the organism itself. It's still coupled to the environment, of course, right? Because you don't just like remember things in a vacuum, but it's more weakly coupled, and maybe like being open to that. So I mean, that's a big open question. That's everyone's question, right? Is that even possible? But beyond that, in more of a specific sense, I would love to see if we can go beyond tau, no offense, Vicente, and see if there are invariants, ecological information that specify some of these like higher order properties of experience, and try to find that. I think that's more tangible than the first question. But yeah, that's what I'm hoping to understand.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, it's that question of is it even possible to talk about X is the question that gets thrown at me the most as an ecological psychologist. And yeah, like my broad instinct is yes, just give me a minute, right? And I think that's and some of these topics, right, that like memory and language, you know, require, we're going to have to do a lot of work thinking about how to even ask the questions ecologically. And I think I think we can. I'm eternally optimistic that we're on the right track. But yeah, you're right. It's a big thing that needs to get done. It would be very exciting to see it unfold. So, Alex, let's finish off with you. What are you hoping to see in the near future to take the ecological approach into the future?
I have some of the same sorts of scientific questions that both Robyn and Vicente were talking about, but what is really capturing my sense of urgency now are issues of addressing urgent social and, frankly, truly existential issues. Climate change and other social justice issues, I think, are essential. And ecological psychology has done a fantastic job of tackling a lot of the basics of perception and action. And I am eternally grateful for the essential work that has happened until then. But if climate disaster happens, none of this will continue. And, I think that we as ecological psychologists need to be thoughtful about what we can do in whatever way. And I think, of course, like with a social, like being someone who's interested in social dynamics and social communication, it's a little bit more natural for me to be thinking about that than other sorts of areas. But I am just becoming, after this past summer, I have become increasingly concerned and activated about this, right? Because if we believe in nonlinear dynamics, as I do, the fact that people are saying, oh, wow, climate change is happening a lot faster than we thought. It's like, of course, because the climate is a nonlinear system. And of course, things are going to change at nonlinear rates. And so I know that this is not exactly like ecological in the traditional sense, but this has been something that's heavy on my mind lately. And so, I would urge us to do what we can to yes, do what we can for the basic science, but given this age of existential crises, think about what we can do to touch people's real lives and try to make a difference and try to make a change. And not everyone is going to be equally able to do this as a scientific matter, but also talking to colleagues who take these approaches in, who are asking questions about these issues in ways that we can, as ecological psychologists, provide information and not ecological information, more like scientific information about some of these things. Because again, if we think that the environment as talking about organism environment coupling and interaction, if we change everybody's environment, we can then affect changes on the other organisms in that environment. And I think that as an optimist, as a hopeful scientist, as a hopeful ecological psychologist, I have to believe that as we continue to change the constraints on others' actions and do what we can, then we can have a more hopeful view of opinion change, of action change, of behavior choices, policy choices, as we continue to kind of help that, rather than taking the more of an essentialist or cognitivist approach, where really the mechanisms of behavior change and opinion change in that kind of approach it's a little stickier. It's harder to talk about. It's harder to do because you think of this sort of this thing that's untouchable, the thing that's unchangeable. Whereas if we take this approach to persuasion, I feel like it is a little bit more hopeful in that way. And I know, again, it was not that was probably not what you were asking for, but that's what I'm hoping for, that ecological psychology can help change the world.
See, I know I'm fully on board with that ambition. I mean, again, honestly, I think it taps to the point that everybody's been making and that we keep coming back to, is the fact that, being an ecological psychologist means learning how to think about process, how to think about embeddedness, how to think about nonlinearity, how to think about systems and how systems operate. And systems thinking is hard, and systems thinking is not something that people are naturally very good at. You have to come to it. You have to work on it. And again, it's a natural part of the way we go about doing things, and doing the things that we do make us good at systems thinking. So we do see these things, right? You can see those more complex, higher interactions. So yeah, I have no idea how to go about doing it, but I think you're right. I think we might have something to contribute here, and I think that would be interesting. And it taps as well as, so just to finish off and just to kind of round that out, I interact with a lot of sports coaches and people who are interested in skill acquisition, because the ecological approach is hitting into that field quite a lot. And there's a friend of mine, Craig Morris, he's an Olympic rowing coach, and he said many years ago to me at one point, I just noticed we were in a podcast chat with Rob Gray, and I was just noticing the fact that this group of ecological psychologists who all do very different things, some coaches, all that sort of stuff, we were just kind of having a chat about a bunch of things, and we were all really broadly aligned on how we thought about all these different kinds of things. And some of it was more sort of complicated and not just about the science. And Craig just kind of pointed out that one of the reasons why we're all interested in ecological approaches is not just because of all the science reasons, but there's a values issue here. We think it's valuable to think in terms of systems. We think it's valuable to talk in terms of organism, environment, mutuality, and the fact that we are not distinct and not separate. And I've thought about that every day for the last 3 or 4 years, whenever it happened. Like it pops into my head on a regular basis. And I find this at ecological psychology meetings and conferences as well. We, as a broadly group, you can get 150 ecological psychologists together at a conference, and we'll broadly get on with each other. And but I think that's quite interesting. I think that really, I'm trying to sort of connect to that point you were just making, is that we don't just have, this isn't just about the science. There's a big chunk of it, but there is this issue of values and just a way of thinking about how the world works and trying to engage in good faith with how we think the world works. And that's come up a lot as well. So yeah, so good. Thank you, everybody. That was really good. Well, we've come to an end. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for your patience, and we hope you had a good time, and hope that this becomes a valuable resource that people can watch and get something out of. And thank you very much to all the panelists for their time and for your energy and your enthusiasm and all your exciting answers, and trying to connect up to some of these sort of bigger picture and more interesting things as we think about not just what the ecological approach is and has been, but what it can be and where it's headed, and some of the genuine potential that it has for communicating and collaborating and connecting and answering the questions that psychologists, we're psychologists, we're interested in why, the fundamental question is, why do people do the things that they do? That's what we're always interested in at the end of the day. And all we're trying to do really is engage with that question at face value and engage with its full complexity, as Alex was saying earlier. So, yes, so thank you very much to the participants. Thank you very much to the audience. And we're all done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for moderating. Thanks for hosting this. This was a very exciting experience.
Thank you all. Have a nice day. I'll see you soon at other events too.